You're listening to On Shifting Ground. I'm Ray Suarez. Support for equal rights for the LGBT community may be at an all-time high in the U.S. According to a 2023 Gallup poll, 4 in 5 Americans support laws protecting gender minorities from discrimination. Despite strong popular opinion, more than 500 anti-gay bills have been introduced in state legislatures across the country this year alone. And around the world, a growing backlash to the rights of gay and transgender people echoes these efforts. I'm joined now by Julie Dorf. She's a co-chair of the Council for Global Equality, which brings together 32 organizations working for an inclusive U.S. foreign policy. She co-founded the group in 2008. Welcome to On Shifting Ground.
Thank you. Thanks for having me, Ray.
Now, local laws, customs, mores regarding civil rights, the freedoms of sexual minorities are highly varied across societies, cultures, religious groups. Was including this broader idea of civil rights in the way America assesses human rights in other countries a tough sell internally in the United States?
I think there's some basic rights that, at least prior to the current iteration of the Republican Party, it was a fairly bipartisan understanding in the U.S. that there were certain basic human rights that everyone agrees to, and we could even get fairly far-right members of Congress and folks to agree that gay people shouldn't be killed for being gay, or torture is a bad thing, even if you're a lesbian or a trans person. So I believe that for a long time, it was less of a hard sell when we were talking about extreme violence and overt discrimination. It's always been trickier when religion comes into the equation, and there's a sense that religious entities have the right to hold discriminatory views, as we would consider that. But then we get into a more difficult place when we're talking about using religion as an excuse for discrimination, particularly when we're dealing with government funds, U.S. taxpayer dollars used abroad, et cetera. Over my 35 years of working in this space, certainly things have changed quite a bit. In the beginning, we were talking to Amnesty International and the UN and Human Rights Watch about including sexual orientation and gender identity as part and parcel of a human rights agenda. We're a long way from those days, thankfully. And I think the long arc has concluded that we, in fact, are part of humanity and deserve some rights. I think where it gets trickier is in places where religion dominates the culture, and particularly an extremist, more conservative view of religion. And I think we're in a moment right now where we're looking at anti-democratic setbacks all over the world. And whether it's in the U.S., this reaction to a multicultural country that provides equality across all kinds of differences, including sexual, gender, sex characteristics, that is really scaring people. And you see versions of that everywhere in the world. And LGBT people are on the forefront.
Well, you touched on it, but let me just clarify sort of your view, because anybody who wants to prove that things are better or worse can come with a lot of ammunition because the world is such a complicated place. On balance, is it a safer world in 2023 to be non-binary, to be trans, to have a long-term, committed, and public same-sex partnership than it was 10 years ago, 20 years ago? Or on balance, has the world moved backwards?
Oh, that's a tough question. I think the answer is it depends on where you are. I mean, my non-binary kid in urban America is safer than 10 years ago. My trans kid is safer in particular locations and then much less safe in a place like Florida. So I don't know if I can answer that on the whole. I do, as an eternal optimist, even in these very demoralizing times, believe that we are ultimately winning. We are winning in the court of public opinion, and that as the next generations evolve, you are seeing queer people in every culture, in every geography, increasingly wanting to be treated as human beings with dignity. And the next generation's increasingly impatient for those rights. I believe that full equality and ability to determine not just your own sexuality and live authentically, but your ability to function in the world dressed and behaving the way that is natural and right to you is something that people yearn for. And as human beings are evolving, that diversity is evolving and becoming more and more the norm. And it is, in fact, scary to conservative traditional societies, but it is inevitable. It's part of our human evolution. And I think the next generations are demanding their rights with increasing vigor that is undeniable.
When America's diplomats try to talk about human rights elsewhere in the world, it often brings resentment and the accusation that the U.S. in particular, but the West in general, is trying to force its notions on other countries with other worldviews and other mores. It's sometimes described as a kind of assault or a kind of imperialism. Is the U.S. ready to champion a kind of universal baseline elsewhere in the world, especially at a time when global rivals like Russia and China are doing quite the opposite? They don't bring that stuff to their bilateral relations with other places in the world.
Well, I would argue that Russia does, but on the other side of things. I think
Well,
they
exactly. Pulling on the other
I
end of the
think they've
rope.
modeled and are increasingly supporting a very regressive idea of family for distinctly political reasons. But that aside, I don't think the U.S. can and should be doing it alone. I know that there are many, many other countries who share these values even more vehemently, and not just global North countries, Latin America, Asia. There are other allies around the world who have like-minded policies and opinions, and I think it should be part of more of a multilateral strategy than a U.S. going at it alone. That said, yes, I think in general, our diplomats are very nuanced. And for the most part, these conversations happen behind closed doors and in much more appropriate ways rather than this very heavy hammer approach. But it is inevitable that that will be part of the reaction. Sometimes it's just a playing out that we know that, Biden's going to say X and Museveni's going to say Y, but behind closed doors, they're going to come up with something else. But I think that we stand by our values, we stand by our principles, and it might not always be comfortable. It may not always be easy, but I absolutely believe that it's right and that our dollars, our diplomats, our non-financial resources that are generated around the world need to adhere to absolutely non-discriminatory practices and policies and need to be representative of American values of inclusion and full democracy, which includes equal rights for everyone.
I'm glad you mentioned Museveni because we're talking about Uganda on this program. We're talking to Frank Mugisha, who describes a horrific level of abuse, of targeting of anyone outside the gender binary, outside the heteronormative. Is Uganda a kind of textbook case of the kind of backlash that you see in some places against LGBT human rights?
Yeah, Uganda is a bit of an extreme example, but yes, it is, in fact, a textbook case. And Frank Mugisha, who I'm so glad you've interviewed, is one of so many heroes around the world who are courageous actors in very difficult situations where they are risking quite a bit of their own safety and security, to lead communities who deserve representation and deserve their rights. The LGBT community has been abused politically in that country, has been scapegoated horrifically at great human cost by politicians. On one hand, it's a classic red herring. It's like, oh, go look at these horrible homosexuals who are ruining our culture, as opposed to the corruption of our leaders or the absolute failure of our economic policies or whatever else might be going on in a country, particularly right before an election. It's a very common phenomenon around the world, a very easy scapegoat for politicians. And on the other hand, you've got pressure from homophobic religious leaders, some of whom are supported by US right wing and a kind of global transnational anti-LGBT agenda. But there's plenty of homegrown homophobia and religious entities pretty much anywhere in the world, and especially in East Africa and Uganda. But they also have been supported by some of the hate-filled far-right extremists in our country, and also in Europe and in Canada and elsewhere, which is increasingly, unfortunately, a real phenomenon. There's a real transfer of strategy and dollars occurring globally that's very strategic and thoughtful and often well imbalanced to what the LGBT communities have as their support. But that said, even in tough situations, even when we're outnumbered and we're outfunded 30-1, I still believe eventually we're right. And fairness does often still win. Not always, and not consistently, and not necessarily at first, but over time.
You mentioned earlier the influence of American religious groups. Is it no exaggeration to speculate that your groups may run into kind of the same people or the same organizations in American courtrooms as they do in Ugandan courtrooms? Are you struggling against some of the same entities trying to accomplish some of the same ends?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, Alliance Defending Freedom is huge in the United States and it's huge globally. There's not an endless list, but there is, I would say, a short list of about 12 bad actors and entities that are everywhere. The Sharon Slaters of the world, the Brian Browns of the world, they should be stopped because it is hateful ideology that is being spread and supported. And this anti-LGBT, anti-gender, anti-trans phenomenon is unfortunately in the US very closely connected to the anti-Semitic, racist, white Christian nationalist movements, extremist movements that are undermining our own country in our own state-by-state situations. And so I don't think there's a huge, grand global conspiracy going on, but I do think there's increasing alignment between hate groups. We're seeing that in our own country, and we are seeing that around the world.
Before there was marriage equality uniformly in the United States, guaranteed by the Supreme Court, there was marriage equality in different provinces in Canada. You got married in Canada. Did you get married again in the United States?
Well, let's see. I got married in the United States first during that Gavin Newsom moment, and that was annulled. And then in Canada, and then no. Thankfully, Mark Leno passed a bill in California that made a certain bunch of our extraterritorial marriages legal in the U.S. So no, my marriage was in Canada and my divorce was in the United States.
So at least we can preserve the linguistic patriarchy and say you were grandfathered in.
Yes, exactly. Very
well,
true.
The new Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson of Louisiana, thinks Lawrence v. Texas was wrongly decided, thinks Obergefell versus Hodges and U.S. versus Windsor were all cataclysmic errors that weaken American families, weaken America's morality, open the door to all sorts of social ills. He's in line to the presidency now, behind Vice President Harris. Are these rights, in your view, in 2023, guaranteed, solid, now securely rooted enough? Or is there still more battles to be fought down the road?
Oh, we are in a very precarious moment in this country. Yeah, our new speaker, before he went to Congress, worked for Alliance Defending Freedoms. He was on the forefront of these anti-LGBT hate groups and legal thinking. I think he's an extremist. I think our particular rights, but everyone's rights are in jeopardy if the MAGA Republican side of our country wins in the 2024 election. And even if they don't win, they're still growing in popularity. And so I think our country has a lot of work to do to figure out what vision forward, who we want to be going forward. And Trump, Johnson, they're problems in their own right, and they are symptoms of something else happening in our country. And I don't know the answers to that. Those are our big existential questions, but they are certainly the ones for everyone, including the LGBT communities, to be very concerned about.
Well, Lawrence v. Texas was considered a kind of victory, a milestone on the road toward something else. At the time, did you think, well, this doesn't mean the battle's over? Do you have a habit of mind now, because you've been in this arena so long, that you can't assume that any of these things become settled, done, that the argument is over?
Well, I think we knew that from just watching Roe v. Wade, right? We had that yet the issue wasn't settled, and we watched state by state by state argue and then actually see that overturned. I think the shock of that decision actually has made many of us much more concerned and about how much could be reversed by this conservative court, including LGBT rights. Marriage equality was such a wonderful milestone, and I think our movement did it differently than the pro-choice movement did in terms of getting enough states on board before going to the Supreme Court. But that said, that wasn't the only piece of our rights. And I think we all knew that they were going to come after transgender folks after that, and that the debate wasn't settled in terms of where does religious freedom meet non-discrimination. I think we fully expected to see more and more subtle cases coming to the courts. I don't think we thought we would see this moment of regression, honestly, or the extreme authoritarianism that seems to be so seductive to at least half of our country, and what the potential ramifications are of a Trumpian style leadership again. We were not no one was predicting, I don't believe. And I think we're still kind of, unfortunately, learning along the way about how bad things could get. It's very hard to wake up every morning and be in catastrophic thinking. So I think everyone does some kind of cognitive dissonance just to keep going during the day. But the real potential of, we know Trump wouldn't leave the office if he got reelected. So we're looking at a very complicated future if we lose the 2024 election.
Well, you've also alluded to the transnational nature of this, and whether you're talking about Hungary's leader, Viktor Orban, right-wing influencer Matt Walsh, Tucker Carlson, Vladimir Putin, Senator Josh Hawley of Missouri, Governor Ron DeSantis of Florida, there's a through line of a heightened emphasis on gender, on masculinity in particular, how to be a man, a return to old norms. Senator Ted Cruz of Texas retweeted a Russian armed forces recruiting commercial as a way of knocking new standards in the U.S. military, implying that U.S. forces aren't as tough as Russian enlistees who've committed horrific war crimes and been killed by the truckload in Ukraine. It was kind of an odd moment.
Incredible.
You're watching this stuff happen, What do you make of it all? I know that your organizations are keeping track of this. What's this new emphasis on masculinity all about?
I mean, obviously it sells. I think the toxic masculinity isn't anything new, quite honestly. So I don't think that is, for me, as shocking as hearing Ron DeSantis's PR person very overtly and proudly say that they got their idea for Florida's Don't Say Gay bill from Viktor Orban, or that CPAC had their one of 20 events last year around the world, including in Hungary and in really regressive places. Or, yeah, this kind of idealization of the strong man, the Putins of the world. It is a very scary time that people are so attracted to that. The misogyny and sexism of it is nothing new, but I think the extreme attraction to that right now, we've got to look at the next level of what is going on with humanity. Where is people's fears sitting that is looked at as the solution? Because it is so clearly not. And we're looking at a very scary world if we let them be in charge.
Are there places in the world that have flirted with this stuff and then had second thoughts, where your council has actually seen improvement, lowering of the threat, black and white letter law guarantees that actually mean something on the street?
Yeah. I mean, well, first of all, we're super excited about what just happened in the elections in Poland. I think getting rid of, well, they're not gone, the Law and Order Party, but I think that maybe they went a little too far for that country, and we'll see what happens in this next era. I mean, even in Hungary, when Orban won overwhelmingly in the last election, there was also an anti-gay constitutional amendment that was put on the ballot, in the exact same ballot. And our side, with not a lot of money, did an amazing grassroots campaign and went really like the old-fashioned door knocking and public education. And we won in the same election that overwhelmingly put Orban back in power. They also said no to an anti-gay constitutional amendment because real people, in nurses and teachers and principals, stood up and said, this is bad for kids. This is bad for our kids. This is not good for our society. And people listened. Taiwan, we won marriage. It's the first Asian country to win marriage equality. And 2 years after that decision, and they started issuing marriage licenses to same-sex couples, public opinion around LGBT people improved by 20 points, from a poll that the government did, not even our side. So I do think that there is the possibility, when you actually talk to people about the real harms done to real human beings that you actually know, that are in your community, that speak your language, your dialect, when parents show up for their queer kids in these harsh countries like Uganda, like those very courageous moms did by writing a public letter to Museveni saying, please don't do this to our children. You say this is for children, but these are our children, and we love them the way they are. We love them the way God made them. When you see the religious left, we don't talk about the religious left, but there are many, many faith leaders out there who are much more inclusive and understanding of what their actual parishioners need and are willing to publicly in their communities have inclusive places of faith. Like, we need to put more attention on that and give them more agency because, yes, I do think that ultimately humanity is going to make some better choices.
That's Julie Dorf. She's from the Council for Global Equality. Thanks for joining us on Shifting Ground.
Thanks.
You've been listening to On Shifting Ground, produced in partnership with KQED, with funding from listeners like you. Today's episode was produced by Sienna Barnes, Elise Manukian, and Andrew Stelzer. It was mixed and mastered by Matteo Schimpf. Additional production and engineering were provided by Rob Spate. KQED's Jim Bennett is our technical supervisor. Jared Sport is our executive producer. Philip Yunn is CEO of World Affairs. Our music is from Blue Dot Sessions. I'm Ray Suarez. Thanks for listening.